Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is a unfortunately timed and a rather pointless research article by Peter Doshi on a purported reanalysis of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines for COVID-19. Then moving from the academics who are involving themselves in the antivaxxers scene to those who have become crazy because of antivaxxers, and how they've started attacking random people on the most tenuous of bases. And how governments are, at least in the case of California, responding to misinformation about COVID-19. There's also the development of completely synthetic milk, and a study that has managed to transmit energy nearly 30 meters through nothing but air. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the article that's made its rounds recently amongst anti-vaxxers. It's called Serious Adverse Events of Special Interest Following mRNA COVID-19 Vaccination in Randomized Trials in Adults. Joseph Freitman, Juan Everiti, Mark Jones, Sander Greenland, Patrick Whelan, Robert Kaplan, and Peter Doshi are the authors of this. Peter Doshi is a well-recognized anti-vaxxer who has, on multiple occasions, pushed and successfully had published work that is thinly veiled propaganda. Unfortunately, it gets published in peer-reviewed publications and as a result is considered more reliable. This is one of the downsides to peer review. It's not a perfect system and things will occasionally get through. This article is a very good example of it. The gist of what they have done is look at the clinical trials for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines from about 3 years ago. They then analysed these to see whether or not there were dangerous side effects associated with them. This is a very odd choice to make. Primarily, why are you looking at data that is 3 years old when the vaccines have been available for 3 years, and you can look at the impact and any adverse events recorded on a scale? That is, not the 30 to 50,000 people involved in the study groups, but millions upon millions of people and billions of doses. The reason the number and timing is important is rather than simply looking at is a, for example, car safe when you manufacture it? You put it through various tests and you find out if there are blind spots, areas where airbags don't deploy, and so on. But once a vehicle is actually sold to the wider market, that's when you start finding out problems. For example, if you have a certain kind of crash, will part of the vehicle safety mechanism fail? Like, for example, Takata airbags. Under particular scenarios, will that then cause failures in a system that you didn't even think of looking at? That is the same sort of process taken for post-market surveillance of any kind of pharmaceutical. It's understood that you'll identify the more common side effects during clinical trials, but there will be rare and very unexpected side effects that will only show up once you start giving a drug to millions upon millions of people. And that's exactly the kind of thing that they should have been looking at, not 3-year-old data which is arguably out of date. This is not to say that it's not possible that they could have theoretically found some kind of unexpected and unknown quirk in the dataset. Likely not a particularly significant quirk, but hey, it could always be there. What the problem is that they're not looking at the data in the terms of how it was analysed. Instead, they're redefining the various side effects their own way. This is a very important distinction. If you were to simply look at the number of side effects and how they're defined for the clinical trials, it's more or less in line with what exactly you are going to encounter. Nothing is surprising. It's all exactly what you would find in any kind of clinical setting. In this case, instead, they've chosen to start breaking it down into much broader categories that aren't as well defined and need to be subjectively allocated. So this is another issue again. The third and perhaps final biggest problem with what they've done is not only have they now reanalyzed data that's relatively useless, redefined the conditions that they're looking at to put them into their own suitable boxes, They have also gone and looked at the number of adverse effects, mostly looking at the severe adverse effects. This is a problem with the numbers being used. To go back to the car example, if you have a car accident, there is only so many car accidents a year. You can then look at how many people are injured in those car accidents, or how many injuries occur for those people. If you look at the number of injured people, they may have 3 or 4 different injuries, which means you have a multiplying factor if you look at the number of injuries, not the number of injured. And this is why when you look at something like drug interactions and particularly adverse events, you don't often look at the number of adverse events by itself. You look at the number of people who developed adverse effects, and then you look at how many of them broke down into serious, not as serious, and relatively benign or minor. They've only chosen to look at the number of serious adverse effects. This means that if, for example, you're someone who has allergies to vaccines and unbeknownst to you, you participated, you now had a serious side effect which may cover multiple serious side effects, and you've artificially inflated the numbers by choosing the number of serious side effects, not the number of people who have had them. This is where the study begins to become rather questionable. It already had a shaky basis, but once you stop looking at the real-world relevant data and instead start trying to pick apart particular things to make it look like a more major event than it actually is, in this case finding that there's more events, when there's not more events, it's the same number, it's just that you've chosen to not have the number of people. The reality is that with any drug or any scientific project which requires analysis, you're going to find that there will be something like that. If you throw enough tests at the data, eventually something is going to stick. Now, they may not have necessarily conducted p-hacking, but they certainly seem to have gone with the approach of throw enough shit at the wall and see what sticks. And that's how they found that of the 2 drugs in question, Pfizer had a slightly higher than initially stated number of issues, whereas Moderna did not. Given that there was better data available, better ways to examine it, and there are better clinically relevant approaches to taking the analysis, what they've found really can't be taken as anything more than torturing the data to reveal what you want to see, not what's actually there. Unfortunately, it is this kind of dishonesty of a kind, at least academically, that leads people down the pathway of becoming antivaxxers. And unfortunately, as antivaxxers become more common, they lead to more events that are going to have you scratching your head or shaking it and thinking, why? Just why? This is where the next article, where unfortunately a pharmacist was attacked by a random individual because they were purportedly involved in the distribution of vaccines for, you would guess it, COVID-19. Waterloo Regional Police have been called to a scene where a man was arrested after attacking a pharmacist. While being attacked, the man heard the attacker saying, "I know you, you've been giving the vaccine to everybody." Yeah, that's because that's one of the jobs that a pharmacist can and often does do. Why this is important is frankly confusing, considering that the pharmacist in question, after being assaulted in this way, then went back to work because nobody else was available to cover for him, and then only once he was started to cough up blood did he go to a hospital. You can imagine that treating them this way makes no sense at many different levels. It doesn't matter if you're on the extreme left of the spectrum where punching Nazis is appropriate, or the extreme right where government involvement in your daily life is inappropriate. Neither of these spectrums could surely accept that helping somebody whose role is to make medicine available for everybody is the right thing to do. Going from pharmacists to doctors, and this time shifting to California, the state has passed a bill that is intended to deal with issues of misinformation, which is an unfortunate characterization of what is being done. The bill by itself fundamentally gives the medical authorities who oversee doctors and licensing in the state more power to deal with doctors who are, in their words, acting with unprofessional conduct. This could, at the extreme end, lead to the revocation of the doctor's license, and at the low end, suspension for up to 5 years. The challenge with this is that it fundamentally relies on doctors going against the widely accepted medical or scientific consensus regarding COVID-19. The problem is, COVID-19, at least for the last 2 or 3 years, has shifted so radically at certain points that keeping up to date and having a consensus isn't necessarily possible. For example, things like ivermectin. In the early days, there was evidence showing that it should be followed up, but that it was not definitively any kind of cure. More research was required, to use the catchphrase of research. Over time, that situation was clarified as it was found ivermectin does not help. There's also issues where you have government organizations like the CDC at first saying masks aren't required, then they are, then sometimes yes, sometimes no. The inconsistency, again, makes a consensus, both medically and scientifically, very hard to establish. And so, when the law brings in a nebulous term like misinformation, you have a problem. The only possible saving grace is that the bill does define disinformation to some extent, and that is misinformation, which the licensee deliberately disseminates with malicious intent or intent to mislead. This means you have to somehow attribute intention or motive to an action, and that may be ignorance or malice. How do you know the difference? And here you find yourself in the rabbit warren that is Alice's Trip Through Wonderland. The law, even if it is signed in, may not pass muster regardless, as there is already a lawsuit that has begun working its way through the system, citing amongst other things First Amendment rights, and requesting an injunction against the Medical Board of California acting on this particular piece of new legislation. That doesn't mean that they can't still act on older legislation. So the laws and rules that are already in place for doctors can already be acted on. This is adding a much bigger stick for the medical board to use, and possibly giving them more leeway to use it. Hopefully we'll know soon as to whether or not this new law, A, will pass the Supreme Court, and B, if they will provide more clarification as to exactly what isn't allowed to be said, and how you can define misinformation more reliably. The problem with research and medical research as a whole is that it does change over time. It evolves. This is why we have growing understanding of what's going on with COVID and how best to tackle it. But it's not just medical and similar research. Humans as a whole, when we're looking at our biology, we are always developing greater understanding of our body, both in its normal function and in pathologies. For example, sunburn. Humans are simply accepted as being able to have sunburn happen. In order to avoid the complications of long-term and repeated exposure to things like sunburn, which are primarily skin cancers, we have developed means of coping with them, whether that's avoiding extreme sunlight, wearing a hat, using sunscreen, and otherwise changing our behaviors and adapting to the environment. Researchers have found that it may not have always been the case that we were so prone to developing sunburn. And this is why it is possible that with the change in behavior as we went from a more nomadic existence to a more stable hunter-gatherer and then agricultural society, we lost the need to resist sunburn. The researchers have found, in an evolutionary sense, exactly what we observe in the modern society. That is, those who live in an environment where the situation exposed them to strong light every day would develop darker skin and maintain that darker skin. This was passed on generation to generation, meaning that they got gradually darker pigments in their skin and became more capable of tanning their skin. This is what we see in equatorial countries now, where year-round it has much higher levels of sun. Parts of Africa, for instance, have incredibly dark-skinned people, whereas the extreme northern latitudes, where parts of the year have almost no sun to speak of, have incredibly light skin. The researchers found that somewhere around 10,000 years ago, we saw the change mentioned. That is, going from being nomadic to hunter-gatherers, and gradually establishing more permanent settlements. This meant that we then went on to an agricultural society that, by roughly 6000 BC, was no longer in a situation where it was constantly and always exposed to extreme sunlight. Over time, this removed the need for the ability to cope with such extreme sunlight because you weren't always exposed to it. In other changes that are occurring over time is the growing movement away from animal-derived products of all kinds. Meat is perhaps the most obvious one that might come to mind. The Impossible Burger is something made from growing cells and creating what is effectively a piece of meat without ever having to have the animal killed. Another emerging option is the dairy industry, and to start with, milk. Production of completely synthetic milk could solve some of the problems around the availability of it on a global scale. This deals with some of the concerns that are raised about this, for example, animal welfare. The others include things like environmental changes from the emissions that cows will make, mostly methane, but there are others. It also is theoretically a more sustainable option to animal-based production in certain environments. As we've described in the past, depending on your country and the farming practices therein, it may not be any more viable to try and grow, say, a plant-based diet foods in areas where you are, say, raising beef cattle. That's because those areas are already unsuitable for agriculture and instead are used for animal raising. This is why those areas, despite being land that could theoretically be used, aren't an effective use of that land. Therefore, the meat or milk produced in those locations is more efficient, even if it doesn't seem like it at first glance. This is something that is certainly not true in every country. For example, Singapore. Singapore has very little land available for anything but people to live and conduct business. This is one of the big reasons why the Impossible Burger and chicken alternatives to the same effect are being made there. They can grow their products in something like a skyscraper and not worry about how many square meters of land are available for animals. You can simply put a laboratory in a building and you're done. This now means that things like synthetically produced milk are going to be a very important avenue of food availability, particularly if you're looking at how you can supply food around the world all the time and ensure safety of said food. The work at the heart of this particular study is using yeast and a particular kind of fermentation that allows them to make the proteins found in cow's milk. This means that you can conduct a fermentation, allow the yeast to do its job, separate them out, and take away the fermented product, which is really very much similar to milk, but you would need to add some additional things, notably something like sugars and fats. These would then make it a dietary equivalent to milk as a final product. The important catch to this is that it's not going to just stop at milk. Once you can create synthetic milk, you can then start looking at further industrial applications. For example, production of cheese, yogurt, ice cream, butter. The avenues that go beyond just the milk alone will be huge, and it will disrupt the entirety of the dairy industry. It's unlikely we'll see any record-breaking dairy production from these particular facilities anytime soon. However, we may have broken the record of the biggest penis ever found. It is a giant Roman stone-carved penis. Why it was made, how it was made, and more, we're not entirely sure, but it's found in Spain and is about 46 centimeters or 18 inches long. One theory as to what it was for is that the stone was part of a larger tower built by Romans when they had conquered that part of Spain, and that its role there was to ward off bad luck and help to improve the love life of the soldiers garrisoned within. Finally, we have at least some kind of serious news to end this video on, and it is the transmission of energy over about 30 meters or 98 feet of air. This is possibly a gateway to technology that would allow for a not insignificant improvement to our current charging technology. The way it works is that the infrared laser was able to transmit about 400 milliwatts of power, and that is enough to facilitate a sensor to work. If you were to run this overnight, for instance, you could look at significantly more charge, or you could be looking at using it to power things like lights on streets, inside buildings for detecting of intruders. The applications are many-fold. The important distinction is that it was transmitted through thin air. That is, there are no wires involved. The technology uses the same fundamental technology as with any standard laser. It has a way to send the signal out and a way to receive the signal. The receiver in this case, though, is small. It's about a 1 by 1 centimeter square, or roughly half an inch by half an inch. This means that the receptor can be fit to just about any kind of common device used by the average person. The fundamental step that is required is one of two possibilities. Either the increase in the amount of energy that can be sent out, in which case they would also need to make the photovoltaic cell, or effectively a solar panel, much more efficient, or they would have to find a way to be able to use the energy that's being sent more efficiently in the way it's being utilized to produce the electricity for the device itself. Once this happens, it is possible that your devices could be constantly charging while they're being used. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.